Hello, everyone. My name is Hari, and I'm one of the founders of Cantina. We are a leading marketplace for security in the crypto space. And today we have a very interesting guest and a very interesting topic to discuss. So at this point, pretty much everyone in crypto and in security know about the ByBit hack. It was a multi-sig incident where they lost almost $1.4 billion. And everyone knows how it happened. Now, it turns out that one of the developer laptops got compromised or developer device got compromised for a safe, and North Korean hackers were able to push a malicious JavaScript onto the official safe's website. And Bybit multisig got compromised because they were signing something that they were not actually reviewing. They were saying something and they were signing something differently. This much part of the story everyone knows, but I think there is like a very curious part of the mystery that very few people have talked about. And Pascal from the CL91 911 recently shared a tweet where he mentioned, hey, this transaction is actually very interesting. You should check it out. So today we have Noah, one of a lead security researcher from Spearbit or Cantina, who is here to like explain what actually happened. And he's gonna help you understand how you can also find this out yourself. So it's not just like him explaining it to you, but like rather, how can you find out this information yourself as well? So with that said, Noah, we'll let you take it. Do you want to start by some introduction and jumping straight to the problem?
Cool. Yeah, I can definitely do that. I'm Noah Marconi, formerly a researcher and developer in a different industry before I got pulled into crypto in 2017. Since then, I haven't looked back. I've primarily been working in and around all things EVM, smart contract development, smart contract security. Spent a lot of time with Spearbit, lead security researcher, helped the core team out for a little bit, and I do lately primarily working with Spearbit and Cantina conducting private reviews. So that's a little bit about my background. In the work I do, I talk to a lot of projects about multi-sig. They're launching something new, but post-launch, the second those contracts are launched, if there's any form of fees coming through, treasury, or administrative rights, access controlled rights, they're all using multi-sigs. And a lot of these teams don't have the background in how to make use of a multi-sig securely. I found I had to talk about a lot of hypotheticals. Realistically, the week before this attack occurred, I was on a call. We did a group multi-sig transaction and we had Gnosis Safe or Safe.global open. And I told them all, assume your device is compromised and you're looking at a fake website. What would we do? How would we defend against this? And then a week or so later, it actually occurred with ByBit. And I had this hypothetical is no longer a hypothetical. It's an in the wild active exploit that everyone's aware of. It's not just a niche bit of knowledge. Very topical. Yeah, so to the topic of today, like Hari mentioned, there's a lot of information out there about the compromise, how the website was compromised and a malicious payload, a malicious JavaScript was presented. But maybe if I can do a little bit of a screen share here, I can share, let me pop it open. I can share a little bit of flavor around what happened on chain. And I didn't actually have handy the paper trail, so to speak, but we work with a public immutable ledger. So as long as we have a crumb to pick up, one of the transactions or a related transaction, we can trace it backwards to the actual exploit transaction. And everything from that point forward is public knowledge. So we can piece it together and tear it apart and decode it and take a look at it. So Hari and team shared this with me. There was something interesting happening with the flow of funds, but for our purposes, I just needed to pick up one of these hashes. Moved over to Etherscan to take a look at that hash and see that it's ByBit exploiter number 54. If you're not intimately familiar with these sorts of things, 54, it means it's like the 54th address that they've flagged for this particular exploit. Maybe back up one step here. Etherscan's pretty helpful as well, telling you where it's funded by. So this number 53 was funded by exploiter 3, which was funded by exploiter 1, which was funded by the ByBit cold wallet itself. So tracing back a little bit, we've now linked up to the actual exploiter address, and there's big red everywhere. So if Etherscan does a really good job. Once something's occurred, they do an amazing job of disseminating the information in situ, exactly where you need to read it. So if you ever see this big red, try not to interact with them. There's a known issue. So taking a look through here, there's a bunch of transfers going on, which makes sense. They performed an exploit and transferred the funds away. Backing up one more step. Sorry, just going to jump around a little bit to ByBit exploiter 1. ByBit exploiter 1 isn't actually the one that performed the exploit. It's the one that received the funds. So going a little further, head over to the ByBit cold wallet or the transaction that occurred. This is the transaction here from no longer a numbered postfix. It's the ByBit exploiter. This is the ByBit exploit transaction on the ByBit cold storage wallet. The exploit transaction is sweep, which is interesting. A multisig doesn't have a baked-in sweep function. So dig a little more and take a look at what actually went on here. And a quick way to do that is heading over. So again, just following the trail through Etherscan. We're now looking at the ByBit multisig wallet. Prior to about 18 days ago, what's that? The 21st is when all of this occurred. Prior to that, everything going on with this wallet was ByBit. 18 days ago onward, something occurred, and it's this exec transaction. From that point forward, they lost control of the account. The exploiter now had full control of the account and did some significant damage. So looking at what actually triggered, this is the trigger itself. The ByBit exploiter executed a transaction on the ByBit cold storage wallet. It was an exec transaction. If you're not familiar with Gnosis Safe, maybe just take a step back. The way Gnosis Safe works, it's a smart contract that will not execute a transaction unless multiple signers have signed off. The way it does that is by anybody calling exec transaction with the signatures. And you can see here in the function signature, I'm just going to highlight it here. You need valid signatures for the payload being executed, surpassing a threshold determined by the multisig configuration. In this case, 3 signers needed to sign off on some payload to trigger a transaction. And that's exactly what occurred here. Now, this view, Hari asked if I can show some of the tools that we would use to sift through these sorts of transactions. In this view, it's useful, but not the most useful for some of what we're talking about. Maybe we can do a little plug for SwissKnife.xyz. If you go to the site, you can click on call data and decode the call data. So instead of looking at Etherscan's interpretation, I can paste in the specific transaction that we're interested in and decode it. And see, this is the multisig transaction payload or call data for the transaction that was executed. And what's interesting is, first off, this address here is a nefarious address, which I'll show you in 1 second. This is the call data, which again, I'll get into. And this argument here, flipping back, we can look at this in more than one places. Flipping back, it's the operation type. And the reason for pausing and showing you the operation type is on a multisig like Gnosis Safe, they've configured it so you can do a call where the multisig will call out to another contract and be message sender. You could call out to a token, you can do a swap, you can do any number of things. If it's a 0, for most day-to-day operations, or for some organizations almost universally, you're going to want to see a 0. Here, it was a 1. And what that 1 means is the operation is no longer call, it's a delegate call. I know we have some experienced people in the audience who know exactly what that means, but to explain it a little bit, a call versus a delegate call. A call, you call another address, another contract, and you call a function or you send value and it executes in the context of that other account or that other address. A delegate call, what it does is it calls out and makes use of the function on the other address, but it reads and writes state to you yourself, the calling address. So in the context of safe, what that means is that it called out externally to a malicious contract, and that malicious contract had a function that I'll show you in a second that could read and write state to the Gnosis safe. And you can see how that's incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous. The rest of it here, not so interested in. Before I show you the exact contract though, there was one more thing I wanted to show you. So the payload. When we make the call out or the delegate call out, the payload here that we're now passing as call data out of Gnosis safe to the other account has a function selector and has some data. So I had it somewhere over here. Sorry, I'm going to bounce around 1 second. I might have closed it. Oh no, I have it. Sorry. Apologies, I've closed something. But if you look at 4-byte database or 4-byte directory, Sam CC Sung's helpful directory, this is a transfer function. And what caught my attention here is that if you're very quickly sifting through, you're not looking at call versus delegate call, you're not looking at the to address, but if you skim through, that does look like a transfer. It does look like a transfer. And you can see on my screen right now how the address is truncated. So I'm transferring to an address, and you really have to scroll or dig deep. If you go back to the original one that we were looking at here, that information is buried way down in this payload. So depending on how you're scrutinizing the payload, it is something that you could miss. And making use of that transfer was quite interesting. Following this thread a little bit, this address 2 is not who ByBit wanted to send the token to or the call to. I'm actually not sure of the background, whether they were trying to make a token transfer, an ether transfer, or any form of configuration update. But
Yeah,
they definitely
they were, so this is a ByBit called multisig. So for context, for an exchange, they have different like addresses. And this is an address where they would keep a lot of their funds. And from time to time, they would send money from this multisig to their hot wallets. So the hot wallets would be like something that could be on a machine somewhere. The private key could be on a machine, and the job of it is to like send money to people when required. And they're the right thing, which is have a cold multisig somewhere which has a lot more money, and it's very hard for you to like take the money out. From time to time, they have to take money out of this for their day-to-day operation. So what they were trying to do was like a very general day-to-day operation, which is let's send some money from cold wallet to our hot wallets. So that's where they got cool. But yeah, continue.
So if that's the goal, if you're trying to send money from a cold wallet to a hot wallet, this too should be one of two things. It should be your hot wallet, if you're sending Ether directly, native currency, or it should be the token address. So if you're trying to move USDC out of cold into hot, your safe would send a transaction, a transfer call data payload to the USDC address. And neither of those occurred. This address here was quite interesting. And in terms of tools, I love this tool. Etherscan has a built-in decompiler, but DDoB, they're a security research firm. They're crazy talented in the tools they've developed, among other things. I'm very familiar as a user of these tools. I can paste in the address and decompile to human readable format. So instead of just looking at the bytecode, what actually happened is they have a transfer function, has the transfer function signature, there's a recipient, there's an amount, there's no bool return, so it's not to spec. Either way, the recipient here is not being sent anything. What's happening? The recipient is being assigned to the transfer variable, which just happens to be a storage variable, which just happens to be at storage slot 0. And then it clicks. What they did is this is a smart contract upgrade. Storage slot 0 in the Gnosis safe.global proxy. Slot 0 is the implementation. They call it singleton, but it's the implementation address. So when they tricked the signers into signing this particular payload, that payload included a recipient, which wasn't really a recipient. It's a new address with all the new capabilities and functionalities. It's a new implementation contract. So follow that thread a little more and take a look at that new implementation contract. Now we see the sweep, and now sweep ETH, sweep ERC20. They've access controlled it, so it's them and only them can now take over the funds held in that particular safe. What's also interesting is they did keep in the transfer function. So not only do they have the ability to sweep, but if they choose at any given time, they can then upgrade again. Once swept, I don't see much benefit there, but interesting that they threw that in. So if you're, as a user, security researcher, developer, make use of this tool. There's some other things that are quite useful as well. If you ever wanted to peek at the UL, it's an attempt to go back to the decompiled IR. May not match one-to-one, but it should be pretty close. And they have some very low level bytecode, but where is it? Without digging around too much, they have some low level assembly if you'd like to read through that as well. But this gives us a clear view of the transaction's impact. Delegate call out to a malicious contract with a payload that then upgrades the implementation to this nefarious address here, which then gives this caller, who would also be labeled in Etherscan as related to the ByBit hack, gives this caller complete control of all the funds inside of that contract. Now, poking around a little bit more, this is the ByBit exploiter in Etherscan, and I'm taking a look at all the transactions that they've executed. Looking back to the first few, they were funded, sure, they need a little bit of Ether to get moving, and they deployed 3 contracts. The first contract was our malicious payload contract that just performs the upgrade. The second contract was a little interesting. It's our sweep contract with no upgrade functionality. So quite interesting, between whatever time this is, 1539 and 1800 hours, whatever time zone, I think we're GMT here, they decided to push out a second contract, a second sweep contract with their upgrade functionality built in. Hari and I were talking a little bit over Discord as well. From that point forward, so this is 20 days ago, 21 days ago, the contracts were deployed. Sure, they're deployed without much context. It may be hard to derive what they actually do. But 20 days ago, they did perform some test exploits. Exec transaction occurred and then sweep occurred on a different address. And poking in there, those addresses seem to have sub 1, less than 1 ST-ETH or Lido-ETH, less than 1 of some other token. They were live testing their exploit. Here there are a couple transactions. I poked around a little bit. They're just out of gas, so there was nothing odd in the payload. They just sent too few gas, which is very interesting to picture. These guys in a government-funded facility executing these transactions with a crack team of whoever they have involved, and then dealing with the same headaches that the rest of us have to deal with out of gas transactions. But again, they executed the exploit on another contract. So this raises a bit of a third time, and then I think, fourth, fifth, and then prime time. So this raises, not only paints a picture of what actually occurred, but it may tip us off to some of the things that we can look out for and how we can prevent it. There's a lot of information out there now today in terms of, maybe we can cover this at the end, some of the preventative measures, but there's more circulation of preventative measures. But seeing this pattern here, we could layer in some monitoring. If you're monitoring the safe factory for deployed safes, and on those safes, any change of ownership or any upgrade, and then subsequently, any transaction that occurs from those safes without recorded signers, that would tip you off that there's an exploit actively being tested. And seeing the pattern here that an exploit was tested days before it was executed, if we did, now that we know a pattern, if we added this to the list of patterns that are monitored for, a large, loud bulletin or PSA could be put out, which may put people on high alert when you're interacting with the safe. Be very cautious with the signing, and here are some of the things you need to reiterate. There's a live active exploit being tested. Hindsight's 2020, but now that we have this information, it is something we can add to our repertoire.
Okay, this is a great explanation. But I want to go back to some of the discussion just so everyone is on the same page. So the way a safe contract works, could you explain like how the singleton works? Because you mentioned that you replaced the implementation contract, but how did it manage to like circumvent, for example, the fact that it was a multi-sig? Did it write to any of the storage slots? I'm just curious.
Awesome. So I will pull open this view here. Oh, bouncing around the wrong direction. So that was the safe contract that I was looking into. But the structure of a safe contract, it's an upgradable proxy pattern. And the way an upgradable proxy works is, it's easier just to show you. You have a proxy. So the way it's deployed is through the factory, which is great for monitoring. We can look at things deployed through the factory. Safe actually has some backend infrastructure that will monitor it. But the safe contract proxy doesn't do very much. It's a smart contract, so it is your safe address. It has very limited internal storage to begin with. It has a singleton, and that singleton is where delegate calls occur out to. And again, just to recap the delegate call, if I make a call to my proxy, that proxy then reads the implementation singleton address and makes a delegate call out to the implementation address. From that point forward, any function that I've called out to in the implementation is executed in the context of my proxy. So any reads from storage, any writes to storage all occur on my proxy account. And it's a great upgrade pattern. You can see here, with great power comes great responsibility. It's not the first time an upgradable smart contract has been victim to an exploit. Famously, actually, the Parity wallet hack was also a proxy pattern where the implementation was self-destructed. So yeah, there are many foot guns or risks and surface areas introduced. But at the same time, if there was ever an error in the implementation itself, and I'll bounce around a little bit, a benefit of having a proxy pattern is if the implementation contract has an error, you can then upgrade. And there is an example of this with I think it's the magic number returned for the smart contract signature verification. Smart contract signers, it's 1271, I think, or 1275. Drawing a blank on the EIP. I think it's 1271. There is formerly an error, and with this proxy pattern, you can upgrade and have compatible to spec handling.
Okay, that's a great explanation. Noah, do you mind zooming in a bit more? And I want to just summarize everything you said, just so the readers really understand what's happening. So it looks like for the safe contracts, the only thing that matters is the implementation contract, and all of the checks on whether there's like enough signers or signatures happens on the implementation contract. And if you manage to change or switch the implementation contract to whatever you want it to be, it's game over. So the person who managed to do it, it can't just maliciously do anything to your safe without having all the signers sign off on it. Is that correct?
It is to a large extent. So on the proxy, maybe I'll just to show you. So we have exec transaction. So this is the regular pattern of going through it. So if you use the UI, it's going to call this before hooks. So you can add guards and that sort of thing. It rehashes the transaction. So there's some attack patterns that are not possible, and it checks the signatures. So these all need to pass, and then the guards occur. There's modules you can install, there's guards, there's a lot you can do. And this is all in safe.sol. This is the latest implementation on the main branch. Now, if you use that function to delegate call out to somewhere that's going to overwrite storage slot 0, all bets are off. It's no longer a safe. Now, effectively, the safe was nuked, and now it's a proxy that points to a completely different contract. It points to a sweeper. So now it's no longer the ByBit multisig. It's now the malicious actors. And that's a dangerous pattern. Where you get into a lot of the commonly discussed when reviewing errors and issues, what you can do is you can misstep. So what we're talking about is this was actively exploited and used for nefarious purposes. But you can also similarly shoot yourself in the foot and overwrite something that you didn't want to overwrite. Imagine if you overwrote some signer storage slots. and could never get quorum. There's a lot of things you can also do. But in this case, having overwritten this storage slot, once that's done and that transaction is complete, there's nothing that exists from the old safe. There was talk, as I think, Hari, you were talking a little bit as well. Maybe there's some pre-post sanity checks that could occur. I'd have to peek a little bit to see, if the call occurs, the delegate call occurs out on the way back in, not on the way back in, but at the end of the transaction. Is there something else that you could have done? The delegate call originally was to the correct contract. So you could do some sanity checks on storage slots like you were talking about.
Yeah, at least if it's possible to have some guards at the end where you check, hey, did I just upgrade my implementation contract? I think that's one way to do it. But I have a feeling that even with like all those guards, if you manage, you can always put more and more restrictions, but if you can convince a bunch of signers to sign something that they shouldn't, there's always some way to compromise your multisig. Imagine if the ByBit had all these guards, even then, maybe like North Korea would be able to like sign away a transaction that sends all the ether in a single transaction.
Yeah.
There is no solution that I feel is gonna work in every case if someone can convince all the signers to sign like a random piece of data.
And that's to your point, it's literally a random piece of data. What they're signing is a hash. They're not signing a complex, easy, human readable payload. It's a hash at the end of the day. And that hash could represent, to your point, a batch of transactions it could be a single sweep transaction, which is why I found this whole thing so interesting. I thought it was just an atomic sweep, especially given the signature was transfer. I thought they signed a transaction that indicated they'd like to give the entire cold wallet to the malicious actor, but it wasn't. It was a malicious upgrade coupled with at your leisure. They could then sweep each individual token. So maybe to reiterate as well, just in case, we're well aware because we've been following quite closely and talking to clients and talking to other stakeholders. But if anyone's listening who's not aware of some of like, how do you prevent this? The first thing to really keep in mind is the assumption that your computer is safe. It's hilarious. We're on a podcast right now, and there's an attack out there, a social engineering attack, where people will reach out to you on Twitter pretending to invite you to a podcast. Luckily, I know Hari and team, so I know I wasn't being tricked. But there's a phishing attack where they'll invite you to a podcast and they'll try to get you working on the podcast software. Something won't work and you'll have to execute an executable, and then your computer is compromised. There's other ones where people will pose as an interview candidate, venture capitalists. Also, on the other way around, they're attacking VCs by pretending to be startups looking for funding from the VCs. So pitch decks, there's a laundry list of scenarios. They know us well to social engineer our industry. So you should try to defend against those social engineering attacks, but at the same time, you should never assume your day-to-day laptop is safe. If I assume the laptop I'm speaking to Hari on right now is compromised, I'm going to act a certain way. I'm not going to have any secrets on it. I'm not going to sign any multi-sig transactions. I'm not going to hold any value on it, because my operating assumption is this is safe for talking to people, but it's not safe for handling value. And I've heard the terminology. I wish I could credit where I first heard it, but think of it like front office and back office. So when you do your job day to day, you're using your front office computer. When you're signing a transaction or handling value or handling secrets, because the website itself is compromised through AWS. If you're handling secrets and incredibly important infrastructure credentials, have a different system and maybe have multiple different systems, one for multi-sig, one for your AWS, one for your day-to-day. If you separate like that, the odds of the important one being compromised are lower simply because you're using it less. So that's the first thing, is just operate under the assumption that you are always compromised. And then with that assumption, it begs the question is, if my computer is compromised, and I'm assuming it is, how do I confirm that I'm not actively being exploited during this transaction? And that's where a lot of the work, sorry, what did you say his name was? It's PC Aversaccio. Pascal.
Well,
Yeah, he's put out a tool that I've I've encouraged all of my clients to make use of and spread the word as much as possible. Cifrin forked it as well, so there's 2 flavors of it, both making active updates to it. But this tool allows you on a separate device without interacting with any third-party backend services. It lets you reconstruct what those hashes should have been. So on my potentially compromised machine, I can check the hash. On my other machine, I can hand construct and then run a CLI tool with a limited number of dependencies to reproduce. And if they match, great. OpenZeppelin's also put out a nice, easy to use UI. So there's a third place I can check again. And if you check all 3, the safe.global site, the CLI tool, and the OpenZeppelin microsite, and they all show the same thing, then I have some confidence that the hash I'm signing is what I think I'm signing. If any of them don't line up, I've had happen. I missed the 0x prefix. I just put the address payload or the call data payload, and it didn't match. It's really easy to feel like, what matches elsewhere, I'm just going to proceed. Red flag. Anything doesn't match, you halt everything, nobody moves forward, and you delay. The transaction does not move forward until all 3 match. In addition, when you sign with a hardware wallet, which everyone should be using, you shouldn't be using MetaMask for multi-billion-dollar transactions, which I'm sure they weren't, but just to reiterate to the rest of us, when you sign on your Ledger or Trezor or other device, those verifications that you made, you also must verify them at the last leg. That's your last line of defense on your wallet.
This is phenomenal advice. And with that in mind, we do have some more time, but I want to use that time for some speculation. You just mentioned that everyone should use a hardware device, a hardware wallet. 100% agree. Did you think that North Korean hackers use the hardware wallet to execute this hack? What do you think about the private key that was responsible for? You saw earlier there was this one account that could sweep away all the funds. Do you think it was a MetaMask wallet, or do you think it was like a hardware wallet?
It's very funny, yeah, because they should be using, and I'm not going to give anyone any advice, but I'm very curious about their security practices, like hack the hacker type of thing. With the sanctions that are on that particular government, I'm super curious. Would they go into Europe or other countries to have Ledger France ship a device to them? Like, how would they acquire these out-of-country manufactured devices? But also, would they trust them? And also, I don't know how nation states handle cryptographic secrets. I know there's widely disseminated recommendations on what they do. Our industry has our industry favored devices, but the HSMs exist for industry at large and enterprise at large. So I'm super curious whether they're like hand bombing it in MetaMask, executing these transactions in a Google Chrome browser, or if they have a more sophisticated CLI setup with an HSM. I'm very curious what they would be doing behind the scenes. I definitely chuckled at the out of gas transactions within the day deciding to hot deploy and upgrade to your world-class exploit contract. It suggests they operate more like some of the startups here rather than, atomically deploy and execute an exploit. Their hand was shown a little bit ahead of time that they're poking around and testing some things out, which is interesting. So with that assumption, I'm going to assume there's some lacking OPSEC on that side.
I agree. I think I get the feeling that this was like a MetaMask wallet somewhere that's doing all the exploits, which kind of is both funny and sad at the same time. And I do believe like under like North Korea, which still has embassies across the world, they should be able to get access to some of the hardware wallets out there. But my personal theory is that this was like a MetaMask wallet somewhere, maybe on a Windows computer, who knows?
So it's so interesting with the operational security thing, because I first heard rumors, not even confirmed, but I heard there was a talk that I should check out where Coinbase way back in 2017, 2018 was talking about the virtualization and the setup they have between hot and cold wallets and how secure that system is. And if they ever have to go to hold cold wallets, like I think there is even a tent involved, so like prying eyes can't see. Just the extreme level of precautions that were taken. I heard that about Coinbase. And it could be butchering the reality of what they do, but it sounded extreme and safe, what they were up to for their secret management. I attributed that level of caution to everyone. And then one by one, you start hearing that there was an exchange in 2018 that was validating balances client side, and they lost a whole bunch of money. There was another one, like Celsius was using MetaMask, and they were exploited on the Badger website for $100+ million, poking around in MetaMask on a DeFi UI to try to do their harvesting. And then the ByBit example would show that they were using a UI, whether or not, I'm assuming they're using hardware wallets, but they were relying on a single point of failure. So yeah, what I'm learning over time is that my early vision of how everyone operated was they know more than me, and they're more secure than me. They're doing things like Coinbase was doing to an extreme but sound degree. And it turns out Coinbase is exceptional in a good way. For our industry, it'd be better if more had those extreme practices where you're not using consumer off the shelf, you're using enterprise grade, and there's no one single point of failure. So if me, Noah Marconi, has access to an AWS backend, I am now a single point of failure. But if me, coupled with 3 other lines of defense, if you're setting up a system like that, then you're a little more fault tolerant.
Okay, I think that is like a great point in this conversation. That I learned a lot from this conversation, and I feel like a lot of the listeners also learned a couple of new things, a couple of new tricks as well, on like how they can dig into a transaction and see what exactly happened. I think it's a very fascinating hack to look at. As you mentioned earlier, they could have just crafted this incredibly good transaction that would sweep all the funds in one go. But instead of that, they just build the smart contracts, tested it in production, modified it maybe like once, and then they pulled off like this slow moving hack. Nobody knows why, but there's probably a reason for it. But the reason could just be like, oh, they just found this, they just exploited somebody's device in the safe, the company behind it. And they just were like trying to exploit, they were trying to pull off an attack like as soon as possible. They didn't have much time to plan it out. So it could be like as simple as people just wanted to execute something and did whatever worked. But it's very fascinating looking back into it. And I think you brought up an interesting point, which is in some way, the parity hack is also similar in the sense that it was an issue with the implementation contract of their multisigs. In this case, it's also an issue with the implementation contract, but it was more like a social engineering attack where the implementation was like maliciously removed. In the other case, it was like a security bug by the developer. In this case, it was more like social engineering and malicious payload in front of like legitimate uses and legitimate like use cases. So I learned a lot. Thanks, Noah, once again for doing this. And I hope everyone listening also like learned a lot. So thank you and bye-bye.
Awesome.